Oh, welcome to Deprogram Podcast. I have some really great announcements to make before we go on with our show, and I bring in my guest, film director Damon Blalack. He's waiting in the green room. We're going to come in and talk about Dracula. But as you all know, I'm going to have a co-host come on, which would be Cal Korf, who is my partner, and be a regular co-host. But we're not going to be with just Deprogram. We're sort of changing the whole platform. So I'm bringing somebody new, and I thought, you know what? Let's start a whole thing all over again. Let's do a whole new concept. I'm not going to tell you what the name is, but it'll be still on this channel. All of the Deprogram videos will be available in the archive, so you don't have to worry about that disappearing. But I'm going to have a regular co-host on, and we're going to be talking all about everything from politics to the paranormal and all that stuff. So Cal will be on, and that's going to be in November. Right now, October, it's still the spooky month, you know, where the veil is thinnest and Halloween is on its way. And we're here to talk all about Bram Stoker's Dracula, particularly film, because Damon, being a film director and does a lot of indie film, that's his area of expertise. So we're going to be talking about that. Before I bring Damon in, remember, if you are not already subscribed on the YouTube channel, click subscribe now, give it a thumb up, share the content. That's how you support us on Deprogram Podcast. And I say us because Cal will be eventually on here. We've just got to get all the things sorted out. I've been totally designing my heart out. You know, I've redesigned the podcast so many times. I'm actually starting to get sick of design. And when I think maybe I've found my identity with this, with the new design that's going to be coming up. And I hope everybody likes it. And I hope everybody enjoys the show. But right now it's Dracula. It's Halloween time. We're still on Deprogram. So let's stick with it now. And I'm going to bring Damon in to the room. Hello. How you doing?
Hello. Great.
All right. How's it going?
Very well. I'm so happy to be here.
I know. It was awesome that you're here because Damon has been a friend for a long while. I've known Damon for a while, and he has always been into Dracula. I think that's probably how I met Damon, was because we both liked the film Bram Stoker's Dracula. I think it was like LiveJournal or something.
It was LiveJournal, yeah. You were
way back from
the
wherever
moderator of that group.
Yeah. So let's start with a little background. Let everybody know who you are and why you're a film director, and why should they listen to you about Dracula.
I don't know why I'm either a film director or Dracula aficionado, now researcher, but that's something that just came naturally from the age of 2 onwards for both of those things. I mean, they're kind of so interconnected. Both the age 2, I was making films by putting action figures up, assembling them on tabletops and shining bright lights on them so that they would create shadows on the wall, and then trying to get my father to record what I was enacting on the wall in shadow form. You just, at the earliest age I could possibly manipulate all these things. There was never a question of what I wanted to do with my life, or my interests, my love of Gothic monsters, Gothic fiction, and particularly Dracula. Even from that age of 2, there's footage of me running around with capes on and dressing as Dracula multiple Halloweens in a row, and it just has been the whole film and Dracula connection has just been a lifelong passion, and who knows where it came from, but it's very much there.
Do you remember your first memory? Like, would you remember the first film that you saw of Dracula that actually involved that figure?
The interesting thing is that I knew the character as well as most of the Universal monsters intimately through the Crestwood books. Some people may remember those. I think most monster kids of the 70s and 80s probably grew up checking those out from the libraries. And of course, at that age, VCRs were seen as more of a luxury item. My family didn't have one
Mhm.
until I was about 14. So, I mean, as a child, there was really no way to see the films. And I think famously, AMC, the movie channel, AMC Classics, it
Mm.
wasn't until I was around that age of 14 or 15 that they even began to show them on television. And I remember them making a big deal about it at the time, saying, you know, this is the first time they've been broadcast on television for, I don't know what it was, decades or whatever. So, I mean, but I do remember distinctly on Halloween night when I was 8, there, my parents had, they went out of their way to rent a VCR, which is completely bizarre to think
It,
of now. And you had to put
doesn't
down a
it sound
$200.
crazy?
Yeah, you had to put it down a $200 deposit to rent the machine. And then, you know, it was like in a little carry case format. And then the
Yeah.
movie they rented for that Halloween was the Todd Browning Dracula of 1931. And it was so interesting because I had grown up playing with the action figures and looking at all I had the Monster Speak record with Bela Lugosi featured on the cover along with the Frankenstein's creature. And, you know, just looking at all the still photos, they told such a powerful story just as stills.
Mhm.
Um, and my parents had taken me to a play of Dracula when I was 4 that really stuck with me. So this was all in my head. So when I was seeing the actual film for the
So,
first time, it was very different for me. It was a very kind of wooden and slow, and I still
right.
appreciated it, but you
But
know,
that's interesting that your parents were engaging you in the arts with this. So I mean,
yes,
not a lot of parents would do that. So I find that really fascinating.
yeah, yeah, you know, much credit to them. They really kindled my, you know, even it's something that they're not interested in so much. Or you know, I'm not sure. I must have been asking a lot of questions, and that just kind of led them into kind of guiding, you know, how I was exposed to everything. But it was something that stuck with me for life, for sure. And then, of course, when I hit age 14, I was reading a novelization of the video game Castlevania 2, and it mentions the main character in that spin-off novel reading the original Bram Stoker novel. And at that point it hit me. I'm like, wait a minute, this is based on a classic novel. I already had known about the historical connection much earlier, from
Oh,
some school books. At age 10 I was reading about Vlad the Impaler and just being, my mind was blown. But yeah, once I was reminded, oh yeah, there is a classic novel, I was just obsessed with this idea of, oh my gosh, what would that be like to read the actual official novel that this all spills from? And so I
mm,
immediately ran and got the novel from my school library, devoured it, and it just blew me away. I had never had something move me so much. And after that experience, I just started rereading it over and over and over again because it exceeded my expectations tremendously. And then I had to know everything about the author, about the true
mhm.
history of how the book came into being, everything.
So what was it about it? Was there a particular thing or was it multiple elements about that novel that blew you away, so to
Well, I
speak?
mean, I think a lot of things were things that I would not have been able to have identified at that age so much, um, such as, but a lot of it's still the same elements that appeal to me most now. But at that age of 14, I wouldn't have been able to put it into words, I don't think. But I think the sort of, you know, it being a story of, I'd always had an interest in the Victorian and Edwardian eras, and the whole concept of repression and, you know, repressed sexuality
Mhm,
versus the women's rights movement that was really gaining steam at that time. The whole conflicts of religion versus technology, as technology was just exploding at a crazy rate. During that era, it was suddenly bringing up this clash with the old
mhm.
superstitions. And then you have the
Sometimes I
whole,
think I'll be
Mhm.
honest with you, Damon. Sometimes I think we're actually going through that right now. Like a
I
similar
have been
thing.
yeah, I've been thinking that we're sort of in a sort of another stage that's very similar, reflecting that. And yeah, it's fascinating. And then the whole East versus West issue too, which, now that we have such globalization, that's not much of an issue at all with us anymore. But you put your
Hmm.
mind inside what Victorian thinker was, how they were interpreting the world at
Oh
the
yeah.
time, and the whole Oriental influence and being seen as potentially a threat. This was even before World War
Yes.
One. I mean, this was, that they could
Well,
sense a fear looming on the horizon of
mhm.
the
There was
East.
a lot, they're seeing a lot of immigration, and particularly from the Jewish community coming into London. And
Hmm.
like anyone, like they're reacting in Dracula might have been an expression of that, but like you said, sexual repression. East meets West. Right in Bram Stoker's Dracula, there's even the hint of venereal diseases and
Hmm.
you know all sorts of. I mean, Dracula's really a really good character to be a metaphor. So I mean, God no. I was going to ask you, do you think that Bram Stoker was afraid of female sexuality?
I know that's bandied about a lot in academic texts, and I think I don't think he was particularly more so afraid of feminine sexuality than the average Victorian male was. I mean, I do think there was sort of a very patriarchal viewpoint of sexuality at play, of course, at the time that he was just sort of, I really don't think he was purposely tapping into any of that. It was just something that, was something that just came about naturally as some way of dealing with these changes suddenly that were coming in.
Right. And I mean, writing, the writing is one of those ways to do that, where you're expressing your anxiety. It doesn't necessarily mean he was going to go out and stake women. I better for him to write about it than just, actually
Yeah,
do that. Right? I guess better in a book. But there's also like, oh, I lost the thought. I hate that when I do that. But there's like this, there was so much. The East was still so undeveloped, so they almost had it as like this wild place because
yes,
it wasn't there wasn't any the same technology. They almost saw it as like this wild, mysterious, scary, dark place where you don't go to, and hence
yeah.
Jonathan's journey. I mean, is really dangerous. I don't know if maybe I don't know this. Most people should know the synopsis of the books, but maybe they don't. Maybe just go over what the storyline is, because most people know it from movies. Most people
Hmm.
know there's 50, 100 different movies. They may not know what the real story is because most movies don't cover it.
Yeah,
But
absolutely. I mean, especially if they watch, the most recent adaptation that gained a lot of steam on Netflix, 2 years ago, it was wildly different, just
I
for the
didn't like
sake of
it.
being different.
I didn't like it. It wasn't my style. I turned it off. Good
Yeah.
for other people if they like it. It just didn't appeal to me personally.
My very good friends were raving about it and telling me I needed to see it. And then I did, and I was very sort of shocked. I could appreciate the idea of doing something new and different just for the sake of that, but it wasn't something I would ever watch again. It was very bizarrely different. I don't know. It just didn't resonate on the same levels as what the Stoker text had done and continues to do, I believe.
Well, and the whole synopsis of it is Jonathan Harker is taking over for this Renfield character. He's a real estate agent. He's going into the wilds of Transylvania via train and horse to serve this mysterious count character. So it's almost like folk horror, really, because he's going into the unknown where people are
Absolutely.
superstitious and silly, right? And then he encounters
Hmm.
this count, and it's a disaster. And the count basically uses him and keeps him there hostage. And he goes back over to London to drain London dry of its good people and its good morals. That's basically the synopsis. And and I mean, there's a lot of different stuff happening in between there, and different relationships and different characters. I just summed it up into an elevator speech, but I mean, that's a synopsis of what happens in Dracula. But it's like, oh, we have somebody who says, I'm not afraid of female sexuality whatsoever. I especially like Romanian women. Well, I'm Croatian. That's so funny. But that's the synopsis. So it's interesting from that we get a movie like that Dracula that you just talked about, that just seemed to be for the sake of being, it looked gross to me. It just was like for the sake of being shocking. I don't know if it was really exploring anything.
No, I don't feel like there was any sort of motive behind the change up. It was, I mean, other than maybe telling a compelling story that was built upon a visceral reaction that they could get from the audience. But yeah, I thought they would have been so much better. Like, I mean, you can retell the same story, hundreds of different times, and it can still carry the same power with it, just by the virtue of having a new cast or new presentation. That it doesn't need to be changed up narratively, because the sort of core, there's a reason Dracula is one of the core classic novels, and why I also, the fact that it was, I don't know if it's lost its status over the past 2 decades or so, but for a long time it held the status of being the second most read book in the English language, throughout all history, after the Bible. So it's
right. It
and
might be
so
contending with Harry Potter, maybe. I don't know.
yeah, I don't know how things have changed, but certainly, I mean, that's a huge deal out of millions of novels. I mean, and there's a reason why. There's some real power to it.
Yeah.
And some people now may think, that passages of the book are rather dry or too slow, or whatnot. But I mean, there's a real staying power with the imagery and with the sort of core themes. I think it's really just the thematic things and the way it was constructed. However Stoker put those together, especially as an epistolary novel, where it's all told through letters and wax cylinder recordings and clippings and maps and all these things. I mean, that's all a really powerful medium to convey what he had bound up inside his psyche.
Right. So, I mean, we had Dean. I mean, we're going to get into how film, because we want to delve into how film changed Dracula on that note, and we'll get into it. But Dean he's an interesting, because he has, I've had him on before, and he talked about the UFOs and movies and stuff like that. And he's saying back when he was 18, he used the Radu Florescu and Raymond McNally's In Search of Dracula as a travel guide to go visit the Carpathian Alps when Romania was still under I can't say it, Brutal's communist regime. Wow. Yeah. That's amazing, Dean. Wow, that would be a trip. My partner, Cal, lived all throughout Europe just shortly after those regimes ended, and it was still like that. He lived there for a decade, in Czechoslovakia and different countries all around there, and had been around. So it's definitely a different country now to compare to when Dean went. It would have been fresh out of communism. Amazing. But yeah, let's get into how film changed Dracula, because you were saying that the book was kind of seen as, a little dry. And so the film actually is what probably gave a film and stage play, I should be more specific, is what gave Dracula its sort of immortal, presence, which made it into, I guess you could say, popular culture, because the book itself wasn't a huge hit at the time when it was released.
Yeah, it had a slow burn sort of life to it. It got very good reviews upon initial release, and and there was a mild sort of progression on the sales, but yeah, it picked up steam over 2 decades until finally thanks to the first adaptation. Of course, most people know about Nosferatu in 1921, and that famously retold the story of the novel, but with completely different character names to try to skirt legal issues. And of course, Stoker's wife, Florence, his widow, I should say, because he had died a whole 8 years prior. Uh, that was sort of something that was able to reignite interest, and I think that I mean that was certainly my 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 journey to reading the novel was based upon how much Dracula had been in the media, and I think most people have seen a Dracula play or film, or just seeing him as a Halloween character at this time of year, posted up in store windows and things. I mean, there's already a media presence for the character that's out there, and then if you're going to read a classic novel, then it sort of clicks like, what would be one of the most interesting things to read if you are interested in the macabre, or maybe you saw something that you want something that's sort of for people who have seen some of the adaptations of Dracula that give it sort of a Beauty and the Beast sort of spin. For them, they might be looking for something like a dark romance, and of course, when they read the novel, they might get something a little bit different than they expected based on that.
Right.
But depends on how much
Because
you read between the lines.
yeah, I mean, you got to remember. I mean, the novel's written in like a journalistic style, and it. I mean, I think it's a little bit dry, but I mean, it is written by a Victorian guy, and you can't in Victorian times you can't just write out say sexual acts. Like you have to be very clever about how you hide them. So isn't
Hmm.
the bite on the neck very clever way?
Hmm.
I mean, like you could. I mean, you could be put in jail if you wrote something over sexually. I'm pretty sure in Victorian times it wouldn't have been very. Yeah, you could have gotten a lot of trouble. Matthew says it's beautifully written and it encapsulates a cultural cross point between Victorian high-mindedness, mystery, and superstition. Very good.
Yeah. There are so many amazing phrases written in that novel, such as just earlier today I was out at my car, and it just these things just pop into my head, and the phrase just hit me out of nowhere: "Dinde trotten reiten schnell," which is the German phrase that Harker hears on St. George's Eve when he's headed towards the Borgo Pass, and it's translates to "the dead travel fast," or "for the dead travel fast," as he's been given a
Mhm.
crucifix by one of the gypsies. And
Right.
it's such a poetic, there's a lot of poetry throughout the novel at different junctures, and so there are a lot of things like that. Another one I think of is we've all become God's madmen, every one of us.
Mhm.
And there's just different passages like that that are just rather poetic, kind of mixed into what, for a lot of people, as you're reading it as a journalistic sort of accounting, particularly the newspaper clippings that go on for pages and pages. We're not used to newspaper articles today that go on as long and as narratively
We're
as a
used
lot
to
of the Victorian
tabloid.
papers did.
We
Yeah.
can thank Jack
And
the Ripper times for that. We're used to tabloid
right.
ways of reading stuff, unfortunately. Before that, it
Absolutely.
was just long form reading that was, you had to get more involved. But yeah, we're used to tabloid. It's crazy.
Yeah, I like what Matthew says here. I'm seeing this in the chat. It talks about, Harker looking out the window and seeing Dracula climbing down the wall. I mean, that and the brides, the way that they appear as, they appear on the
Mm-hmm.
moonlight, as motes of dust that then take form, so many things like
Yep.
that. They're just so uncanny and bizarre that you never hear about in any other media. You never see those sort of things laid out in such a way it's just a very, he wasn't just pulling upon, Stoker was not just pulling upon stock ideas related to
Yeah.
horror or legends. I mean, he was in a way, but it was in a very sort of lyrical way of, I mean, like what I'm just describing with either of those two instances, for sure. I mean, it was very much sort of more poetic approach to horror, which I don't think, I mean, even though the Gothic tradition by that point had been around for almost 150 years,
Right.
it just, it's still, the way that he approached it was in sort of a very more, it was kind of like more like a tapestry. It was very just beautifully presented and intricate. It wasn't just thrown out
Well,
there as, here's a
and
giant
those
ghost or
scenes with
something.
the bride, were they not based on nightmares that Stoker had? Like, did he
Oh
not have
yeah.
nightmares? So you can tell he's pulling from his dreams and weaving a bigger story around that. So he was obviously having weird dreams about demonic women.
Which again, yeah, a lot of people point to his sort of the Victorian male's mind of female sexuality and the fear of women taking that into their own hands and everything. And I mean, it sounds incredibly quaint by today's psychology and society, but yeah, what beautifully rendered scenes that we get every time there's a faithful adaptation of that. It's it's like
Right.
it really speaks to something very primal, whether it was born out of a patriarchal fevered imagination or not. There's something to it that really hits us deep down.
And I mean, we don't know if that dream was espoused from fear of women. It could be something completely different. Is like, I mean, you can say that, but that might be your own projection. I mean, we don't know what was going. He could have had that dream because some lady attacked him in the street the night before. We have no idea why he had that
Yeah.
dream. We
Well, I
just
mean, it's
know that
famously
he
blamed on
wrote
his
about it.
There's a. I'm gonna have to ask, Dacre Stoker, his great grandnephew. I'm gonna have to ask him like this whole thing about the dressed crab salad he supposedly ate at dinner. It's just something that was because I think I had heard him mention before that was just kind of a legend, that there wasn't anything really substantiated about that having been a thing. This idea that he had eaten bad crab and that's what caused the dreams. But
Well,
yeah,
yeah. If he, well, I know if I have to take a melatonin to go to bed because I have to wake up early and everything is wonked up, I do tend to have some weird, like, I get up and I go, whoa, what the heck was that? As opposed to if I create my own melatonin, it's like I don't even remember. I don't know what happens as you get older, but I remember I wake up and I'm like, well, I'm sure I dreamt, but I just don't remember anything. And I always take that as a good sign, because if I start having lots of dreams, it's usually like my brain's trying to sort out a problem. So I'm like, if I don't remember, I'm
hmm
like, okay, I don't have anxiety. That's what that means. When I don't remember, I don't actually think of that as a bad thing. That's
yeah,
just me. Maybe other people have a different thing. Because if I start having dreams about people, I'm like, okay, what are they up to? If I haven't dreamt about you, you're all good. That's how I feel about it. But now, Bela Lugosi, I mean, that version of the movie, 1931, it may not be adapted to the novel, but the fact that he was able to get in there as a Hungarian actor and perform that role, I mean, I don't think Dracula would be what it is today without him being there. And people say the Spanish version of the 1931 is better. Okay, but maybe the shots are better, but I don't think anything would have been. I don't think Dracula would have been shot into the stratosphere if it hadn't been for Bela Lugosi's acting presence.
yeah. It would have been one of those very artfully done, films like Vampire. For those who may know that, the Dreyer film from 1932 that's very beautifully rendered, and people talk about it for its artistic merit because of the shots and the
Yeah.
structure and everything. But Lugosi's performance is the reason to see that. I mean, it really, he defines that character so well, and of course he had done it on stage for at least 4 years prior to the film release. So I mean, and wowing audiences, it was a very indelible approach, and a lot of it has to do with his ancestry of coming from that region, but but also just the intensity of his eyes. His acting was just amazing. His
Mm-hmm.
intonation, what a powerhouse performance. And I mean, as far as I'm concerned, that was something that until for me, until Oldman came along. I mean, Lugosi was the high water mark, and I think I know there's a lot
We'll
of
get into Old Men, guys. We're getting there.
yeah, yeah, Christopher Lee. And I hate to discount Christopher Lee because I had never seen a Lee Hammer horror Dracula film until I was older. Than I think I had seen I had already seen Oldman by the time I then went back and dug in and discovered Lee's performances. But I mean, I name both Lee and Oldman as my favorite actors ever.
Oh, yes.
It's thanks to their and my fun, one of my favorite films ever is with Lee is not even a Dracula film, but that's how I became aware of him.
Yes. Well, my mother grew up watching Christopher Lee. So after I'd watched, she took me to see the 92 Dracula in Vancouver because in our small town, it just never came for a long time. So we went and seen it at Christmas time. And my take on Christopher Lee's, I can see why the audience likes his Dracula and I like it. It seemed very dangerous. I was like, I wasn't allured by him. I was like, that's a dangerous and vicious Dracula. I couldn't see how the women were sexually attracted to him. And I'm going to be straight up and honest. I like his Dracula, but I didn't see how he could lure them in. He was so nasty and he was so brutal. And it was so, I can see, I like it, but it wasn't the same as, say, Gary Oldman. It wasn't the same as even Frank Langella or the first romantic kind of fallen hero kind of vampire is Dark Shadows. Whatchamacallem, Barnabas Collins, like that. Those characters were alluring. Christopher Lee, I'm like, he's just straight out of SOB. No offense. Before we go, and I want to thank, we just got a super chat from All Around Arbiter. Thank you. You got any questions for Damon? You get the first pick, so you can think of some. Thank you very much. That is awesome. Before we go on to other movies, Matthew said something interesting, and I'd never heard this before, and I want to pull it up. He said, I heard that because I always thought Dracula came from Dracul, from the Romanian, but he says, I heard that in the Irish language, Dracula means bad or tainted blood, referring to family feuds. Bram Stoker clearly does research. I've never heard of this before. I always thought it was pertaining to Vlad the Impaler, which was Dracul. That's interesting.
And I've always wondered if that was something that tipped Stoker off when he began to dive into research. And I know, some scholars like Elizabeth Miller disputes that there was any connection at all between Vlad the Impaler and Dracula. And, there's all sorts of reasons why or why not. And, but, it is very fascinating. And the fact that I'm glad that was brought up because, Stoker as an Irishman, he did so much research about the East, particularly about the Transylvanian region. And but then there's so much Irish legend mixed in, and you can't really, it's so interwoven and it all works so beautifully. It was just a perfect conflux. I mean, he was the right person to be channeling that sort of idea. And I'm really glad that was brought up. It's very fascinating. Yeah, Matthew says maybe the coincidence tipped him over the edge. I think so. Yeah, that's certainly. We lose Melissa. I think we may have.
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, there you are.
He said the Dracula saved Universal. Ironically, Dracula also saved Francis Ford Coppola from bankruptcy.
That's true. Yes, absolutely.
Yes, he did.
That speaks a lot to the power of a single storyline where if you're being faithful to it, you're drawing upon that inherent power. People are going to want to see a new adaptation that's faithful.
Now we also have Matthew asking, I wonder how much of Bram Stoker's Dracula built upon The Vampire by John William Polidori, first published in 1819.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I was going to say, when you mentioned Dark Shadows, I mean, certainly from the screen, I mean, I guess Lugosi was the first sort of screen adaptation of a suave, dark figure who, was alluring but also represented death, that conflux of sexuality with death. But that the Polidori's The Vampire, was certainly, in text form. It's very short, but it's something that sort of brought up the idea of the Byronic hero, because Polidori was basically kind of describing Byron, whom he was close to through his whole life, and that was something. The way he describes the vampire, it's amazing to read something from 1819 and see that, like, the way he's describing the vampire in question within the story, Lord Ruthven. Everyone at the time was saying, "Oh, this is obviously not a critique, but it was kind of like a takeoff of." Of Lord Byron himself, the way he would enter a room at a party and all eyes would be on him, and he just sort of gracefully glided through. And for those familiar with Anne Rice, I mean, she's my favorite living author. A lot of her descriptions of vampires and their interactions with culture, human culture. A lot. I feel like she pulled a lot from Polidori's The Vampire as well.
And I'm flashing back to high school because I used to, after watching the 92, because the 92 Dracula, probably my first idea of Dracula was probably the Count from Sesame Street. I'll be honest with y'all. I didn't really get into it. I knew of Dracula just from the pop culture, but 92 version, it was so theatrical. It was so amazing. My parents took me, I just loved it so much. It pulled me into that. And I was reading stuff like, by Lord Byron, biographies on him. I just got pulled into all this, and Anne Rice, and that one movie pulled me into a lot of the more romantic stuff and Gothic literature, and Victorian penny dreadfuls. It opened it up, and I believe that the success of that in 92 helped pave the way for the success of the Interview with the Vampire films. And it opened up that
absolutely.
Gothic vampire culture.
It really did. It opened up the floodgates to where, that studio, Columbia, they immediately followed up with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, a film that I dearly love, but, it obviously had problems.
Yes.
And it wasn't as successful as Bram Stoker's Dracula and what it was doing for a number of reasons. But then also Wolf with Jack Nicholson, Michelle Pfeiffer. That was sort of, they were trying to reinvent the whole. This was I think maybe some people may be familiar with the recent attempt. I say recent, we're talking about the last, 7 or 8 years. Universal Studios trying to reinvigorate their monster franchise, trying to treat it as if it's a Marvel property where, they've got these characters that can come in and out of each other's films, and they're trying to build that, or I don't even know if they've given up on it or not. But I mean, early 90s for sure, because of the success of the Coppola film, you had Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, you had Wolf, you had Mary Riley with Julia Roberts, which was, an attempt to sort of retell the story, but from a slightly different angles. The Jekyll and Hyde story, seen from the point of view of the maid, Dr. Jekyll's maid. And so there was a lot of traction there, and that also, of course, I'm sure helped launch Interview with the Vampire.
I think they missed a lot of the artistry. Like when Coppola, we're going to get into the Coppola version because we can't help it right now. But when Coppola, he's an amazing film director to start off with, but he also, it was the style. He had this, he knew that he was going to have it be theatrical. He used costume, and he used old style filming tricks right on set. I'm so glad he didn't use CGI or any of the special effects at the time, because it would so be dated in a really bad way. 92 CGI, yikes. Yeah, it would be bad. Yeah,
sure.
And we have people agreeing with us. Look at that.
And someone mentioned earlier about the I've never known whether to call his name, I don't know, Louis or Louis Jordan, but that BBC adaptation is still today, and it's still the most faithful adaptation. It may not be as big screen spectacle as a Coppola movie, but it actually was very well regarded, and still to this day, people who love the book, it's such a wonderful version to check out. And then, of course, I almost mentioned earlier the John Badham version with Frank Langella.
Frank Linda. I love that
You
version.
know,
We do.
that's a very good version, and even though it mixes up, this whole swapping of there's been such a tradition, and let's swap Lucy and Mina and Dr. Seward, and let's make Seward
They do
Mina's
that. They
father, and
do that in the
it's
movies all the time. They swap
yeah,
them around.
and for no reason. It's like, why was that even a conceit? I don't know. Other
Yeah.
than maybe like as they did with that recent Netflix series, just mixing it up just for that sake, of being new. But I don't know that it
Yeah.
adds anything. I think it actually detracts from the power that Stoker
Yeah.
was obviously pulling upon.
Well, the one thing that I like about the 92 version, and they say, well, it's not the book. No, it was freshening it up with that Vlad the Impaler. But I like that they detailed the journey properly, and they got like, how often do you see Quincy Morris and Arthur? Like, you don't see the
Yeah,
characters
they had
brought in,
never
and they
really.
did that. So they outlined it, and then the people literally go back to Transylvania and track him down, the same narrative. And I thought that was something that you didn't see very often. Most
And I
directors
know
took shortcuts.
narratively, from a play or from a film perspective, the idea of backtracking and going to a place we've already been, like that's kind of a death knell to narrative. You don't want to go back to something. That's why flashbacks are discouraged to early screenwriting students. So I
Oh,
understand why they eventually started cutting out the return to Transylvania and let's just kill them off in England.
yeah.
But but
Well,
yeah, I mean,
probably a
it
lot of
really
budget
does.
constraints too. I mean, sometimes it's
Sure,
budget
of course.
constraints.
Yeah, when you can start with a castle, but then to have the chase to the castle, a chase scene. I mean, obviously, your budget blows up. So suddenly, you have to end with this long chase
Yeah.
back across the continent.
Yeah,
And I
exactly.
was going to
But
mention too. Well, we'll talk about it in a minute. Go ahead.
no, no, you go ahead, mention it. Go right ahead.
No, it comes chronologically after what you were mentioning. Eventually, we'll talk more about Coppola's adaptation, but there's
Mhm.
something that was even following that in the wake of the success. I mean, I can throw it out there, I guess, just as
Sure,
a
go ahead.
one sentence sort of. But I had long read about the proposed sequel to the '92 film, which
I
haunted me for
never heard
years.
about that.
Whatever happened to that? Why did it not happen? And I found out firsthand from James Hart, the screenwriter of the '92 version. He said he even sent me a picture of the title page of it. It's called "The Death of Dr. Van Helsing," and it was a follow-up sequel that picks up 7 years later, where we
Hmm.
see Mina and her young son Quincy, which we find out was, he's his parentage is in question, and there's a whole adventure with them again with Van Helsing and everything. And so, I mean, I thought of this because you were mentioning all the success that the Coppola film brought to,
Right.
in this case, Columbia Studios. But it wasn't just Columbia; it was also just a larger. I mean, think about also along with Interview with the Vampire in '94, which of course had nothing to do with the Universal line of films of all their classic monsters, but you also had The Crow, James O'Barr's The Crow. I mean, Gothic
Oh
fiction
yeah.
was suddenly vogue again.
Gen X, we were like totally goth and alternative. We were so nihilistic. No wonder we ate this stuff up. We're like the lost. We're considered the lost generation. So I mean, that's probably why the people who created social media were Gen Xers. We were totally like, yeah, this stuff happened. Like we were totally goth. You wore black. You listened to, The Cure. You listened to Nine Inch Nails and all that stuff. That's what you did back in the '90s when you were a Gen Xer, late Gen Xer. Anyways, I don't know. That's what I did, anyways. I'm sure. Yeah, we got people. We got people. Emily's Gen Xer. I know. I'm pretty sure. The Crow. Woo! We got people agreeing with us. Let's other see. I'm seeing if we have any other comments. Oh, someone wants to know, what do you think Lon Chaney's portrayal of Dracula would have been had he not died and lived in, because he originally was cast to do it in the 1931 Dracula? How do you feel
That's
about
a
Lon
great
Chaney?
question.
Yeah.
Yeah, Lon Chaney. Oh wow, what an amazing talent. Everything he did was just gold. And I feel like had he done that as originally planned, I think that it would have been just a powerhouse. It would have been. I think it would have been just as popular a film, and we would have had just a different sort of consciousness of the character of Dracula, and it would have gone a different way. We would have Halloween decorations up today with whatever makeup he chose to use for the character.
Right.
It wouldn't have been the evening gown, or not gown, the
I
evening
think,
suit and the
yeah.
cape and the widow's peak we all think of. It would have been something different.
I think it
And
would have been a little more, there would be prosthetics, and I think we would have been a lot more horrified. Probably a little
mhm,
more Nosferatu.
yeah,
We
for
got someone
sure.
saying Smashing Pumpkins. I seen Smashing Pumpkins back in the day in concert. They were great. It was awesome. Um, we got someone also mentioning Van Helsing starring Hugh Jackman was a good movie. I don't know why it didn't become a movie series. I don't know. Sometimes, this gets me on because the Van Helsing one, The Brides, or the Van Helsing movie, The Brides, I don't know, I just found them kind of like just these catty old women. I was like, "Oh yeah, I seen those chicks in high school." But the Francis Ford Coppola Brides is just something I wanted to talk about because they really got to me. I thought they were amazingly done. Like
They were
it was
dead
so
on to the text.
sensual, sexual, they were seductive, and they were kind of cruel. You knew they were going to eat that baby. Like I just thought it was like I've never seen the brides done
Beating the
as good.
horse into
Oh yeah,
pulp. It's like
I know. I was like, okay, they were done
terrifying.
right. The other
Yeah.
brides, they're just like, "Arr!" And I'm like, oh whatever. Or CGI fangs come to them. I'm like, I wasn't even remotely interested in them. But the brides, the nudity, none of that bothers me. It's fine. It's appropriate because it was done. Like I was just like, I've never seen the brides done more accurately than the Francis Ford Coppola movie, in my opinion.
It's exactly at the age of 14 when I was reading that novel for the first time, and that I think that one scene was the scene that just cemented it for me, and I just couldn't get it out of my head. And it absolutely, when I saw the Coppola film just a few years later, it was so dead on accurate to what I had been imagining. Just the sort of duskiness of the scene, the sort of just the very exotic Eastern quality that the brides had to them. Where you really got that East versus West uh, sort of overview that Stoker was going for in his novel, where they looked like harem women who had this sort of they had a lot of mystery about them
Mhm.
that kind of added to the sexuality, on top of the fact that they're
Yeah.
traveling in as specks of light on as like dust on the moonbeams.
And more importantly, the actresses that were hired to do that role were all European women and models.
Mm,
They just had that. European women have that thing about them that I don't want to be rude to American or Canadian women. We just, it's a little different. But that choice, I think, just brought something to, I don't know, they just understood something about that, and maybe Coppola did, and they contributed that I don't generally see in American films,
yeah,
or American
yeah.
actresses.
There's so much authenticity to the little, and I think that's why Coppola is such an amazing director, is the fact that he picks up on those little nuances that matter. I mean, I'm not going to say that the brides in the Van Helsing movie weren't easy on the eyes. I mean, obviously, they're gorgeous, and
Oh
I think
yeah.
they're very interesting to look at. But they had none of the sort of nuance and the sort of mystery that the Coppola went, and even in the way that they're lit. Not even aside from their
Mhm.
acting. I mean, just the presentation of them. I think was
Yes.
completely
And
different.
they literally come up through the floor. Like in there, they just appear. And it's done all right on set. No CGI, and it feels real because it is real. It's really happening right there, but it was done so wonderfully. I just
Yeah.
I could watch that scene over and over again. It's not and yeah, it's amazing. So we have a comment about the music by Wojciech Kilar.
Oh my
It's
gosh, so
isn't
amazing.
an amazing soundtrack?
Yeah, Wojciech Kilar's score is just one of the greatest film scores of all time, as far as I'm concerned, and it's just fabulous. What he wasn't doing something that was it wasn't expected. It was such a classical style score, very operatic at times, and just I mean, take a theme from that, like "Love Remembered," the Mina Dracula connection. I mean, and you hear reprisals of it throughout, and in different ways even. It's so just every single track of that score is just dead on perfect. And it's very European too. I mean, I remember reading about Coppola saying he specifically wanted a very Eastern European direct composer to put the music together so it would have that flavor.
Right. It reminds me of, like, Roman Polanski. He used a lot of European and Polish composers, like, when his work on Rosemary Ba like, you just it's different because you've got someone from a different culture coming at from a different angle, like Rose I love Rosemary's Baby. It's a freaking amazing film, and but
Hmm.
the music attached to it is it's not done by John Williams, it wouldn't work. Or, it's they he used a Polish composer, I believe he did. And so when I hear this by Wojciech Kilar, it's just like it's so I've never heard something so appropriate for a Dracula movie ever. And you even have heard them like that the song that plays when when Jonathan Harker's traveling on the train. It's like "Da-na-na-na."
Yes.
They've used that for other
Oh
promotions and other
yes, it was
films,
used
and
on Star
so
Wars: The Clone Wars as a snippet of action music, and it's one of those times where a composer borrows a snippet of another composer's work in tribute as an homage. But yeah, I
mhm.
heard that and I'm like, it was so beautifully done. Like you said, it was so great that it's used. Several snippets from that score are reused all the time for things.
Yeah, I know, it's great. So we talked about that, he did an old school Coppola used an old school style. And do you remember why he decided to do that? I know there's been lots of
Yes,
documentaries, but I can't remember why Coppola
yeah.
decided to go old school. Do you remember why?
He and I think this is another brilliant nuance that he was picking up on, but this idea that you know the year that the novel, I mean if you really want to get pedantic about it and academic, I mean the novel technically takes place in 1893, not 1897, which was the publication date. People quite often make that mistake. And in the Coppola film, it opens up with the titles, that says 1897, London, 1897. But nevertheless, film had become a thing by 1893. I think a lot of people, they think the beginnings of cinema was somehow in the 1920s, when really, if you go back to 1893, that's when it really, I mean, if you really want to go back, 1888, you had the first sort of film clip. And but by 1897, it was going into full swing. You had the rise of Méliès, the magician, who created, I mean, I'm not kidding here, thousands of films that were all based upon what he could devise, how he could manipulate the camera to do. He was such a famous stage magician, and he saw so much potential with tying a film camera into that. So there were just thousands of films that he created based on all these special effects that could be done with smoke and mirrors and trapdoors and wax dummies and all these things that could just, it's all about how could he continue to blow his audience's minds, not just on a single stage wherever he happened to be that night, but in a permanent way worldwide. And so that whole birth of cinema right around late 1890s really is what Coppola was paying homage to, because he realized, hey, the novel um, it came out then. And so,
Mhm.
what would it look like if this novel were created? If it had been adapted to film at the same time the book was released, what sort of techniques would they be using? And I think that
Right.
was so phenomenal because it gives it a real primal edge to it. It
You feel
really
like you're
hits you in
there.
a way. It's very authentic. I mean, there's
Mhm.
physicality to all of it. And
The
he tasked
only
his son. Oh, go ahead.
right? No, you go ahead. Finish up. No,
I
that's
was just
fine.
gonna say, so he tasked his son Roman, who was the second unit director on the film. He tasked him with figuring out all these techniques. Um,
Yes.
so Roman went and I mean, that's all he did was he studied all of these old, books of that the magicians had put together at the turn of the century and the early filmmakers. How did they pull off this effect? How did they do this? And of course, there's not a lot of research out there on that because things weren't well documented at the time. But he was
Right.
able to reconstruct a lot of these very bizarre effects. I mean, think about the bride's feet, you know, through the dust on their way to
Yeah.
Jonathan, and you
Or
so
in
see those
the
imprints
yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, how do you I mean, today that would CGI piece of cake. Then and
and not
sometimes
look as
doing it
good.
on set sometimes doing it on set is easier though. Like it could be
Yeah.
cheaper. I heard Ridley Scott
Yeah.
saying like he did something on the movie Legend. And it was literally like some fishing wire and some light and bling. It cost hardly anything. And to do it CGI would be like phenomenal amount of money. But he's like, we did it for hardly anything.
Hmm.
And I think that's what's missing from film today. If I'm not a film director, but if there's such this process of digital stuff and doing this, like you don't
Hmm.
really get to play with your hands and discover interesting things or play or be as creative in the same way. When you're doing a lot of
Hmm.
digital rendering, it's got to be precise and straight on. It's all digital, it's all accurate. The collaboration is a lot different. It's a lot different. I
Yeah,
don't
for
know.
sure. Yeah,
I,
absolutely.
I I think that's what I miss about most horror movies today. Is like I mean Romero's George A. Romero's uh Dawn whatever what was it The Night of the Living Dead. I
Hmm.
mean you got to be creative and be able to just do things on the go with your creative energy. If you're sitting in a studio and you have
Hmm.
to I don't know, I think somehow it interrupts the creative flow sometimes. It's different.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, even though you can have all of those things in place where the actors can feel like they're part of the environment and interact with it. I mean, filmmaking is so difficult. It's still by the end, you can have all these perfect things seemingly in place, but then uh, in the end, things may not balance correctly. Famously, Bram Stoker's Dracula, the Coppola film, was a disaster at early screenings because of the way it ended. And it took George Lucas coming in and watching it, and George Lucas said, "You need to do it this way." And it was one of the
Ah.
only films in Hollywood history where they were able to bring back the two biggest leads. When Winona Ryder and Gary Oldman brought them back just to reshoot the ending, just because Lucas was able to point out, you guys have
Right.
betrayed your story. You've got to do this other thing. And it's like, so
Interesting.
even
I didn't know
it's
that.
hard enough, even when they've got the physicality to work with,
Mhm.
if the structure is not there to begin with, it's
That's right. So, I
can be
mean,
an obstacle.
Coppola used all the old techniques, but I'm going to assume that the editing techniques is what made it modern and move faster pace because editing techniques in film have changed a lot. And it's one of the reasons why I realize that when I watch older films, I get a little like, it's because the editing and the way of editing a movie has changed so much and have changed the pace and they understand so much more about how to do action and edit different scenes and points of view. I have a feeling that the editing is a lot different in Coppola's film than it would have been from like I don't know 1920s 1930s. It moves it along better. They're just like I mean you go look at
Yeah.
Star Wars for instance and you see the original run of the film. It's slow and all you have to do is bring in the right editor and he turns it into magic. So editing has a lot to do with how well a film can be as well.
I had an early film instructor teach. my classes that everything that needed to be known about ways to edit a film and tell it narratively had all been figured out by 1928. And I kind of questioned that at times, but then as I began to rediscover a lot of European cinema over the past 130 years, it was like very, I began to see there were so many things, but it was Coppola's, it's very much more of a European sort of style of, using even like you think of the chase scene at the end of his film that's very frenetic and just, high pitched, and, a lot of cross cutting, and it looks like very modern editing to us, but, it was something that if you go back to like a Sergei Eisenstein film from the 20s, like
Mhm.
his Ivan the Terrible movies, or any of the films he did with the huge armies of invading soldiers, all the cross cutting and the going from close ups to crowd shots to
Okay.
even like what we call MTV style editing of like little half-second flashes. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
all
yeah.
that was sort of in place.
So they were in place, but there are some films, like I've noticed, where they almost film a scene in just one long shot. And so it kind of loses your attention after a while. So maybe it was just certain
Yeah,
directors' choice to do that. And I don't, maybe there were some directors who were like understanding it more than others. And I've just seen some really
yeah,
poor movies because, I mean, for instance, if I go from this scene, show you in, and then I can, I overlay, it breaks it up so then people
yeah,
can see that. It just that's just me clicking 3 times, but it changes it
sure.
from us just talking, and people are like, oh, what are they doing, what's coming, or whatever. But there's some movies where they don't, they just keep it going
Yeah.
and going and going, and it drones on, and
Well,
you sort of
that's
lose
what
your
I was
audience
mentioning
attention. Yeah.
about the European influence. A lot of those Eastern films early on were the ones that were really inventive, and it was the American films that became the dominant film force, which was
Yeah.
just very kind of staid and steady, sort of more theatrical presentations.
Yeah. One, of course, technology. I mean, I just love. Okay, speaking of technology, I'm trying to hide this comment and it won't let me. What's going on here? Oh, here we go. Oh, there we go. That's good. Now, do you know one criticism that I hear of the 1992 Dracula? And it's part of me agrees with it, and part of me is like, I don't know. A lot of people are very critical of the Lucy character, and they think that she's over sexualized. How do you feel about that? Do you think she was over
Oh my gosh.
sexualized?
No, and because I think in a 2 hour film, you have to heavily condense so much from a novel. And you really have to put the characters' personalities more forward. I mean, this was a criticism that Stephen King had for The Shining, which was that he felt like the character of Jack Torrance, as portrayed by Jack Nicholson, that was too over the top, right off the bat. It was too early, too much, too soon. But I feel like in a 2 hour film, as opposed to taking 24 hours to read a novel, it's going to be you have to have certain things telegraphed differently. It's a different medium. You have to sort of bring things to the forefront more. So whether it's through the lighting or the editing or the music or the acting or all of that combined. And I think it was very important for Lucy to be sexualized in the way that she was, because I mean, for instance,
Mhm.
the costuming on the film, so beautiful and so amazingly thought out, and the fact that she's wearing her snake dress, I mean, that should be some sort of big sign to the audience. But how many people sitting there would sit there and put it all together, and oh, she's wearing, she's all proud of her snake motif dress, that must mean she's feeling sensual. Like, it's not enough for a modern audience, or and maybe audiences have always been that way. I don't want to say that they should be hit over the head with themes, but I mean, just a little bit of an edge to her already sexualized nature as you see it in the novel. That I think that's apt.
Yes. And we, I always say when people say that, I'm like, we're not talking to a 1930s or a 1960s audience. We were talking to a 1990s audience. And it does seem a little bit, but I think it also shows how Dracula is affecting her. It's a more like impactful, like, wow, she's really getting crazy. I
And
don't
I
know.
think too,
That's
for
my take.
by that point, for sure, there was a conception that the Victorian era was largely sexless, and that there were,
Hmm.
that a lot of these things would have just been unthinkable. And I mean, it really put the blood into the story, I mean, so to speak, and really capitalized upon that sort of. It could make a modern audience feel in a lot of ways the same way that audience a Victorian audience may have felt about the character reading some of the things she said that would make them blush in the novel.
Hmm. Yeah, and yeah, it's definitely a big contrast between the Mina character, and you need that. Like you don't really want Mina and Lucy to be like just similar. I think there needs to
Mm-hmm.
be a vast difference between those two characters, because you have one character in Lucy and you know she's going down to hell with a handbasket with Dracula, but Mina has this studious sort of like toughness about her, this masculine quality. As I believe Bram Stoker even says that in his book, that she has a mind of a, brain of a man or something like that.
Yes,
And
right,
they're
right.
trying to really, he really pushes that through, because she's very studious and very not just proper woman, but she has this more driven part of her that's not so frolicky and fancy, which is very masculine.
You know, and you bringing up the character of Lucy, this was something that kind of blew my mind recently as I've continued to read into people's comments and sort of I'm always, as a filmmaker, I'm always exploring what is it that people respond to, and how do women respond differently than most men, and how does someone of this age respond versus someone who's younger. But the scene with involving Lucy in the garden scene where she is seduced by Dracula, I shouldn't, raped by Dracula is more apt with that character.
Hmm.
She's outright raped by him, in he's in a bestial
Yeah.
form, and I always thought, that for most women that would be so incredibly shocking and probably off-putting to most women to see that, and it would be something that would be a point of curiosity for a lot of male viewers. But in the past couple of years, I've seen so endless comments from female fans of that adaptation of the film, talking about how it's the hottest scene ever, and that
Yeah.
like nothing does it for them more than that scene. And it's like they
Interesting.
just go on and on about getting so worked up
It's
about it.
Well, and it's the
And all the
presentation.
male and the
Mhm.
male audience members are the ones who are saying,
Yeah.
"Oh my gosh, that's disgusting," or "That's
Right.
bestiality," and they're
Right.
against it. And it's the opposite of what I would have thought.
So if we had presented women with a scene from, say, Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange, the rape scene, I think that would bother them. I think it's the presentation of it. It's just both the same thing, but it's how they're presenting her being lured and willing, and someone being dragged and unwilling. I think that's the difference, in my
Uh-huh.
opinion, anyways. That's just my
That's
opinion.
a good point.
We have let's someone saying that the Coppola version is excesses. It's all excess and gaudy garishness.
Yeah.
Just no
Um,
subtlety.
I think the what I appreciate that he did was take the theatrical history of it all into account, the sort of Grand Guignol tradition that had arisen,
Mhm.
in the 1800s of doing these very sort of shocking depictions on stage that were basically built for it's all about getting people in the door, and being sort of part of the current of the talk on the street. It was very much sort of a driven towards that way. A lot of you know from based on upon a lot of the interviews I've read with Coppola and all of the previous films he had done, I don't really think that he was being excessive with
Mhm.
Dracula, particularly just to shock. I really feel like it was really in this sort of operatic spirit. Dracula was
Yes.
known as a stage production for so long before it became known as a film staple. And you had, like, I mean, even all the way up until even in the 1970s. I mentioned earlier Bela Lugosi. He had performed on Broadway as Dracula for years before he took on the screen role. Then you had Frank Langella, same thing. He was on Broadway for years before he then stepped into the role. So there's always been this very heavy stage. The stage production of Dracula has been a
Yes.
staple of that, even to the point where Coppola shot much of the movie on sound stages purposely to make it look like a theatrical setting.
Yes.
And his original conception was to have no backgrounds at all, just the characters wearing
The studio was like,
their
no, no,
costumes.
no.
He said that, famously said the costumes would be the sets, and it would all
Yes.
be that one scene where Mina and Dracula are dancing amongst the candles, and it's all black. The whole movie would have been like that if
Yeah.
Coppola had
They
had
gave him,
his.
they're like,
So I
we'll
mean, the
give you
studio did
one
rein him.
scene, Francis. We'll give you one
Yeah,
scene.
and I mean, they're saying
I,
that to Coppola, who won Best Director many times over, and all these,
okay, so
accolades. He's got the top films of
I
film
don't
history.
find it gaudy or garish, like overdone. That's why people go and watch opera. I find it operatic. I find it dramatic. I love stuff like that. I loved going to see Phantom of the Opera live, the musical. I actually love stuff like that. And it's artistry, it's art, but yet they're putting it in the context of a film, like the costume designer. I mean, she's
Hmm.
creating works of art. You're seeing works of art, and sometimes they can be over the top, but it's literally the costumes represent the character. Like one of the biggest things about this movie that I noticed that hasn't wasn't really pushed in a lot of other films is the transformations that Dracula goes through. They're super important in this
Hmm.
film. The costume and how people change and what it looks like. Like transformation was huge in this film,
Yeah.
and all of Dracula's forms were really put out there like no other film I've ever seen.
You're absolutely right about that. His transformations had never really been explored on film before so much. I mean, occasional shots, process shots of, say, Lon Chaney Jr. turning into bat form and flying away, things like that. But yeah, this sort of emphasis on the visual. Movies are a visual art form, and the more that you can telegraph certain things, and I don't know. I mean, is some of it too much in certain instances? I mean, perhaps. I mean, it's hard to know. I mean, unless you saw multiple different cuts. I mean, I think there are still like a crazy amount of hours of the film that was shot that actually wasn't ever released, even as they've already released half an hour worth of deleted scenes, and a lot of those are pretty much, tamer versions of what we eventually saw theatrically. But who knows what's in all that other footage that hasn't been released yet? It's
Yeah.
interesting, and I think that the number one thing I have to say, other than the theatrical tradition of the novel, being translated from book to stage, and then from there eventually to the screen, the silver screen, is the fact that Coppola wanted, knowing, again, we talked about the film connection. Film was on the rise along with all other technology. You see all the typewriters through the film and the wax cylinders and all that. But also, there was this sort of weird transition from stage to cinema. And if you think about the cinema scene, the men are watching, the men that are sitting there in the audience, they're laughing at the stupid jokes about the husband's wife being replaced by a more attractive woman, or
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah, yeah,
the
yeah.
topless woman walking around. I mean, earliest cinema really thrived upon sexuality, or very body sort of humor, and that's how they got the people into the tent or into the doors of the theater. And along with that is the idea that Coppola was envisioning of the whole film being basically a fevered absinthe dream. I mean, absinthe, that was the fin de
Hmm.
siècle, maybe mangling that French word there, but the end of
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
century sort of transition. That was the absinthe craze, and that's why we had such
Yes.
brilliant visual artists like, you know, um, Van Gogh and many of the paintings of the time, painters of the time, and artists and writers, people, poets who were
My
really
favorite
inspired
era of
by
art.
the absinthe traits. Yeah, so
Yeah.
he wanted to really reflect that sort of absinthe mentality that people in that time were undergoing, and the Art Nouveau art coming out shortly after that as well was a huge influence. And the Klimt, even the title where it says Dracula, it's in Klimt's gold lettering, and then Dracula as an old man wears not when we first meet him, but it's called his death robe, where it's like
Right.
it's based directly on a Klimt painting. There's so many.
Right. The
Every
golden
single
one.
shot
Yeah.
of the film is based on a famous painting or sculpture or
It's
poem or
inspired.
something.
They're
Everything's
speaking
pulled
about the art
directly
from the
from that.
time.
Yeah,
I've got
so
a
that's why I think
comment.
it's very art driven, and that's
Matthew
probably what gives it
Lee
that
Ambleton.
access.
Interesting. Matthew's been on the show before. I think you guys would be like, he does a lot of great writing and has an interest in absence and stuff. He says the absence scene is an interesting addition. Something else that had a degree of Victoriana to it, also used in the film From Hell about Jack the Ripper with Johnny the Depp. Johnny the Depp. Johnny the Depp. I
You've
don't know
turned
why
him
I said
into a
that.
mafioso suddenly.
Johnny the Depp.
Johnny the Depp.
Freaking hell. Oh my God. Sorry, Johnny. But yeah, it's a big motive. I mean, a lot of artists used absence to inspire whatever trip, just like some
It
people
was an
might do
excessive
DMT.
era
Yeah,
to have
it was
Stoker's
that,
novel come out in the
you know,
midst of all that art. It
Sir,
was shocking art for the
yeah,
time. It was
Sir
excessive.
Quinox.
That's why I feel it's
Yeah,
justified.
Sir Quinox, who asked that question about excessive, I think we can answer that by saying it was an excessive time. And he's trying to relate that to you as well. He's literally trying to make this movie a painting, an Art Nouveau collage of whatever was happening in the time, which was excessive.
Yeah, even Dracula's castle itself is a model after a famous painting from the era called the Black Idol, which is, this large, huge, giant creature like enthroned upon he's sitting on a throne. And,
Yeah.
they basically took that famous painting and they, silhouetted it so that Dracula's castle would look like that painting come to life.
Yes.
And that's, is that packing a film frame to frame with too much information for most people that are more tied up in the story or the narrative, maybe, but I don't know. To me, it's layers, like an onion. You can just keep peeling it away to find out where certain things came from, and it all ties back to those Victorian references.
Exactly. We got, perhaps Coppola should release a Dracula redo version like he did with Apocalypse Now. Now, not
Yeah.
everybody agrees. They say it wasn't, Apocalypse Now redo wasn't an improvement. I haven't seen it, so I can't say. But
I didn't feel like the Apocalypse Now Redux they did in 2001. I felt like it was interesting to see an hour. Well, what was it? 45 more minutes worth of footage. I thought that was great to see, but not as a narrative film because it betrayed certain mysteries of the earlier cut. But then he finally, what was it? 2 years ago, then he came out with the final cut, which was kind of a blend between the two. And I feel like that film, I would say it's at least on par with the experience of the original. But yeah, I like it when he tinkers with things. Last November when he released The Godfather 3 Coda, I was over the moon to see that and see how he had changed what was his most maligned film in that whole series. And it was very, I thought it was interesting the way he restructured it. I would love, like I said earlier, he's, I've heard there are, I think it was one of the second unit cameramen was telling me that there are like hours of footage we haven't ever seen. What would it be like for Coppola now to go into the editing bay? And but famously, before the film was released theatrically, there were 32 different cuts of it, and he had to end up finessing that all down into what was going out. So, yeah, that would be a great thing to see. And I don't know how much you're wanting to focus on, Dracula in general, or I don't know if we're getting too top heavy with just the Coppola version. But I'm
you can go wherever. It's. I don't have any structure here. We've been winging it the entire night.
Yeah.
And going with the questions, I was going to say, like you mentioned how you were, or as a youth, you were already doing a lot of film stuff and play and getting into that direction. How did this movie change your career as a film director and where you were going to go with being educated and do your own films?
I mean, I can say is that I mean, again, it all goes back to age two. This is when I have my earliest memories, and I knew at age two I wanted to do something with film. And at that point, I mean, in addition to those Universal monsters, Star Wars was everything to me, and I mean, still to this day, as big of a Dracula fan as I am, I'm just as huge of a Star Wars fan as well, and so both of those were influences on my approach to becoming a filmmaker. But back in the late '70s, early '80s, there was no way to learn how to do all this. The idea of becoming a filmmaker was a pie in the sky dream. It was, it's crazy now that what kids walk around, with having in their pockets, is more powerful than professional cameras were on the sets of Hollywood movies just even 15 years ago, and the ability to immediately edit things and polish it and do color grading and what they can do to manipulate sound and audio and music and everything. It's just, the world has just been transformed. It's been something that's it's very empowering that people can be so easily pulled into that world now, whereas before you had to fight for it. It's who you knew. It was all about how much money you potentially had to buy equipment, to learn how to use the equipment, all of these things.
Right.
But yeah, Dracula was always a huge interest for me film-wise. But when the Coppola version hit, it became my first. I mean, with the novel having been my favorite novel ever, I had high hopes. And then when I saw the film, for me, even though I've loved every Dracula adaptation throughout the years, for sure, the Coppola one just blew me away so much. It's for almost 30 years now. It's been my favorite film, and it was
Amazing.
the biggest inspiration for getting me through, just for studying film, going to film school, and and now as an academic, I just turned in my PhD dissertation a few weeks ago, but at least half the thank
so
you.
exciting.
The half of that is all sort of examining Coppola's film and why, and not just the film itself, but how he tied it all in back to the original story and why this, why that, how it all was influenced, and how different cuts of the film tried to finesse out some of those subtleties of the Stoker novel. Thank you so much.
I have one more question. I have one question for you, because you recently did a convention. I think it was last year. I wasn't able to join. It was last minute, but you did a lot of stuff, and you got the chance to. I don't know if you met him in person, but you got the chance to interact with James V. Hart, who wrote this book right here. He wrote the script.
Yeah, there you go.
And the book
to
Dracula. How was that? How was interacting with him? And are you going to be doing future conventions? Are you going to be doing more with this? I want people to know, because you've talked to the man, you've met him, you know him, and he worked with Coppola, he wrote the book, and he wrote the script.
Yeah, absolutely. It was I've interacted with him, off and on, and and once he was a guest at my film festival, Red Dirt Film, this past March. But then 3 months ago, I got to meet him in person, and that was just a dream come true, because I'd been trying to reach him for 28 years. I used to send random letters to the studio, hoping they would forward them to his address, and and then when I finally figured out that he was online 7 or 8 years ago, I started trying to reach out. I finally made contact, and it's been such a wonderful experience getting to interact with him and learn more about his methods, not only because of his involvement with the Coppola film, but because of that book you just held up was him, and it was written with he and Fred Saberhagen, the two of them. Put that together.
The images out of it.
uh-oh. It's a novelization of the film, but it also includes some things that they had wanted to be part of the
Which is
finished product
great.
that weren't. Yeah, and Saberhagen, for those of you who may not know, he's an amazing author who has penned many famous Dracula novels starting in the 1970s. Oh man, you're gonna
My
have to bind
pictures
those
have
in.
long fell out. They fell out
You
right
need a
from the
new
middle, and
copy, perhaps.
I had to staple them. This is an original right from the day. This is from grade 10 in high school.
Oh wow.
Be
Yeah, that's a
careful.
great read. I loved that so much.
Yeah.
But yeah, having Saberhagen weigh in as well as an author, taking James Hart's scenes and breaking it all down and making a very compelling story. It's so weird to read a novelization of a movie that's based on an original classic novel. It's a completely different experience. But you know, Hart was talking about, he was telling me about how influenced he was by Saberhagen. And that's what gave him the idea. He had read a lot of the Saberhagen novels, which were the first time that things were told from Dracula's perspective. It's up in the air with the original Stoker novel who the main character is. A lot of people say, oh, well, it's obviously Jonathan because the first 4 chapters are all about him, but then it switches gears and then it's all about Mina and then we even come back to Mina in the end. But
It's written in
then a lot of
journal
people,
style, so it's hard.
yeah,
You're
yeah,
reading
and then you
people's
say, well, it's
personal
Van
journals.
Helsing because Van Helsing comes in at the third of the way into the plot, and then but he's the one who unites everyone. He gives them the knowledge. He does most of the heavy lifting. So it's like, who is the main? I mean, this is an eternal academic debate. Who is the main character of the story? And I thought the interesting thing was the Coppola film. For better or worse, depending on what people expect out of an adaptation, it was sort of taking Saberhagen's point of view of let's tell it for it's called Dracula. Let's tell it from his point of view, which the original novel is known for famously not featuring much of the character of Dracula at all. The
Yeah.
namesake of the novel is only on like a few pages of the entire book and
They
very little
literally talk
dialogue.
about him. They're all talking about him. He just seems to be this menace that they all talk about.
And that's what makes him more mysterious and scary. But then what's it like if you're seeing it from his point of view? And someone mentioned earlier in the chat, I wanted to point out, because I do think it's one of the most important milestones of the novel to film, was sorry, I'm tripping over my words, the Dan Curtis television adaptation from 1973 with Jack Palance in the lead role as the Count. That was a fairly faithful version, but it was the first one that famously made the link between Vlad the Impaler and Dracula, and that Dracula was perhaps pursuing Mina because she was, or he thought
Romantic.
she was his
And
reincarnated
it's
bride.
no shock that Dan Curtis created Dark Shadows, one of the first empathetic vampires in Barnabas Collins. So I'm not surprised he did that.
Absolutely, yeah,
I'm not
and
surprised.
it's
I watch Dark Shadows all
yeah,
the time, by the way. God, I love that show. That it's amazing.
yeah.
I love the bloopers.
Oh yeah, those are fun. A lot of
Those are fun.
fun.
Yeah. So yeah, the Jack Palance one was great. It's good. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
and in fact, I think Saberhagen, I don't know if he's ever on record saying this, but I really think that it was perhaps that uh, Curtis version making that link with the historical figure. Well, who is Drag? Where did he come from? How did he become what he's become? Let's take. I think Saberhagen probably got the idea to write his books based on perhaps that television film, and that changed a lot. I mean, just 3 years after that, you had after the Palance version, you also had Interview with the Vampire, going back to Anne Rice here. That
the
her
novel.
novel was seen as one of the first
Yeah.
anti-hero versions of the vampire
Right.
character from their perspective, what it is. And anytime you sympathize with the monster in that way, there's a lot of things that get shaken up. And I know the Coppola
Yeah.
version is very heavily criticized for supposedly introducing that sort of Beauty and the Beast fusion,
It's not
but
the
it had been
first.
done. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
certainly not the
It's
first.
not the
And
first.
in fact, it's more faithful maybe not to the Stoker text, but to the Gothic sensibilities of that era, the literature coming out from the early 1800s all the way up until, if you're including the Gothic romance paperbacks of the even up into the 1960s, 70s, it
Hmm.
was very much keeping in the same flavor as all of that.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, people don't read as much anymore. And I'm even guilty of not reading as much anymore as I used to, because probably because of the internet and social media and doing stuff and working and being busy. But people don't read as much, I don't think. And
Yeah,
I listen to things more than I read now.
absolutely.
Is I
Yeah,
mean, is
I'm the
there any
same
really good?
way.
Yeah, I feel bad about it, but at the same time, I'm like,
Yeah,
there's so much
Audible's
I'm
become
doing that
a
I can't
huge
get to
boon
it.
for me, but I still, wish I could be sitting and just reading off of paper, but it's like, because of things being so busy, so it's too easy to just get an unabridged audio book on Audible and
Yeah,
listen to it while you're driving.
or listen to this
Unfortunately,
podcast.
I
Yeah, listen to this podcast, everybody. Come on now. So, I mean, we're coming up on the hour and a half. I don't want to keep you too much longer. We've discussed a major theme. Is there any other really important theme about Dracula that you want to mention that I've forgotten about?
Hmm. Oh, there's so much. I mean, I think one of the best things I've ever read for anyone really interested in the original novel or just vampires in general, and maybe, how much, or even Gothic fiction. There's a brilliant book by Clive Leatherdale. The exact name, the title, it's Dracula, and then I forgot what the subtitle is, but it's basically an examination of all of those sort of very deep-rooted themes that makes the novel what it is. And for someone who is interested in even just Gothic fiction in general, it was, I feel like, the best examination of those themes and what makes the novel tick.
Hmm. So we have a
Again, yeah,
question.
yeah.
What about the themes of Stoker's novel? What to him was the vampirism symbolic of? What do you think it symbolized for him, for Stoker
Well, the
personally?
yeah, I think well, yeah, you can split that off in many different directions, but I think first of all, the fact that every culture worldwide, going back to antiquity, every single, and we're not talking about a globalized world like we're in now. I mean, we had entire continents separated from each other, where the concept of vampirism is the only one of the only like common linkages between all cultures. Even with separation of some peoples of one continent versus another, never having interacted for centuries. This concept of what it means to take the life force out of another person, and perhaps the idea that it's a monstrous being that comes at night when we're most vulnerable and takes this essence from us, or even similarly the incubi or the succubi taking semen from sleeping males and impregnating women in the form of an incubus. I mean, this exchange of life force that humans have is such a it's such a violation that opens, it's all about this sort of exposure to the uncanny, to our innate fears that we have. And we talked about the female sexuality, the expression of that is explored in Dracula. The very act of Lucy going and taking that lifeblood essence from even children out on the
Mhm.
heath at night, and before that, the brides with Harker, that stealing a man's essence,
Right,
particularly in an age where that would have been incredibly, um, just for
right.
taboo to even think about, and so yeah, I think all these sort of
Well,
things come together. I think that's what
and
motivated Stoker.
let's remember, in the Stoker book, Dracula isn't described as a suave guy with a top hat.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
He's
he's
kind
seen
of
as
creepy.
the sort of creepy, uh, the Easterner who was. I mean, as you said, there were some issues at that time having to do with immigration and
Mhm.
uh, and the what used to be called the Gypsy people, the Romani people, flooding into different parts of Europe and facing
Mhm.
persecution and everything. But still, like, there's a sense in the so-called civilized Western Europe that these Romani people coming in were stealing their life source, in the form of
Right.
money. It was a monetary thing.
Mhm.
And that perhaps they were, sucking them all dry.
Yeah. But I
Yeah, that
think
whole sort of clash of cultures has a lot to do with it.
Stoker is also borrowing from history. Like you go to Romanian history, and a vampire is a rotting corpse. It's not
Yes,
a romantic
yeah,
Lestat or Barnabas. It's a rotting, disgusting corpse that's about to bring disease to you and destroy your whole family. Kill
right.
your cows, kill your crops. I don't know what
Yes,
else. It's not
yeah. There
very
are a
positive.
lot of so-called true accounts from the 1700s, particularly in places like Poland, a lot of those Slavic countries around there, Lithuania, Croatia.
Mm,
There are all these stories of all these people who were supposedly haunting their family members and draining them afterwards, and they had that the village elders had to go down and stake them, and how the corpse would react to it with groans and with um, sort of some sort of they would unearth them and they would still look as preserved as they had been 2 years
yes.
prior, and all these things that we can account for now scientifically, why this or why that. But I mean, these are all things that fed that whole idea of a sort of fetid, rotting corpse coming back to haunt the people that they had been closest to in life. And yeah, so Stoker definitely honored that with the description of his foul breath and the fur on his inner palms, and
Mhm.
the a lot of the it's interesting to see in the adaptations how that's handled. How far do you hew to one end of the spectrum, which is that the kind of the source, to what we then get with ultimately the sort of Byronic figure, the
Right. Sort of
anti-hero
melding.
that informed Lugosi, and then of course Langella, Oldman, and Oldman's a good that's another thing that I think is really
Let's talk
important,
about
and
his
this goes back to what
performance
you were
before we
mentioning.
go.
Well, yeah, you were talking about his transformations. It goes back. I think we were meant to see a lot of those sort of transformations, that really disgusting transformation that he's in a cocoon slithering around on the ship, the
Mhm.
Demeter. He's transforming into something else. It kind of took the sort of romantic hero and mixed it with the sort of putrid, kind of
Grotesque.
revolting side of him,
Yeah.
with the fur on his hands and some of those other elements. But yeah, his performance, of course,
Yeah.
you
I
know,
mean,
one of
outstanding. This is a guy who, when he played Winston Churchill, I had no idea it was him. So, I mean, he's a
yeah,
phenomenal actor. He's a phenomenal actor. He's been my favorite
yeah.
actor. I mean, that movie introduced me to him, so I found him in other movies. But I mean, he's phenomenal, and his
And Beethoven, I
I
mean, he
yeah,
absorbs whoever he's portraying, and
he's
he just
so
does a brilliant
method.
job.
He's
Yeah,
so
yeah, oh
method,
yeah,
and he's also his Dracula has an androgynous thing about him. Whereas,
yeah.
the other Draculas are very masculine. His Dracula is very, there's
There are a
something
lot of feminine
really
qualities to his
strange. There's
movements, and
something very strange about his Dracula and unearthly, and he's not this masculine. I mean, he's in this bright red gown flowing around with his white, kabuki hair. It's
yeah,
very interesting.
it's beyond gender. Even when he
Mhm.
delicately puts his fingers in and to pick up Mina's picture and look at it, and then the way he's so like
Yeah.
just kind of cat-like and poetic about it, like it's just
Yeah.
very lyrical, very feminine. But then there are times he's incredibly masculine as well, and I think
Yes.
he transcends to be that dark angel. This is going back to the question you asked about, or someone had the question about Stoker, and it's almost like a perversion of Christianity. It's like Stoker was such a devout, you know, um, as most most Victorians were, very, very stout, either Catholic or Church of England Protestants, and this sort of perversion that's inverting everything. Even you see in the Coppola film, Dracula's last words are the last words of Christ, echoed back. So yeah, I think for Stoker, it was kind of an exploration of what would the Antichrist look like? What is the opposite of everything that we know and what our whole civilization is based upon in the modern era, which is these concepts of Christianity that we live in. Are you still there, Melissa? It looks like you froze. Oh, yep, we lost her again. Listen to them, the children of the night, what music they make. Yes, absolutely. That is another one of those poetic passages. It's incredible that everyone always, you think of that when you go back to this novel. I like to mention about the Romani gypsy element being played upon in The Wolfman, which again, yeah, that was a wonderful, I thought, a good revival, a good attempt at trying to bring back all those Gothic greats on film. Let's see. Yeah, a lot of great comments there. Just kind of while Melissa's out, scrolling through to see if there's anything that I've missed. Yeah, Matthew's asking about the Dracula Untold. Definitely that film did a good job of trying to sort of come up with a new mythology with the character. And, it's interesting to see another historical reenactment of that character in the 1400s in the region, and trying to account for some of that character's life. I think there's a lot of I don't know. I can see what they were doing with it, and I know they were trying to set up a lot as part of this kind of shared dark universe that the Universal was attempting. Oh, there she is. Says her internet went down. Okay, hopefully she'll be back. I don't know. Can anyone still hear me? Is anyone still here? I don't know if I'm talking to myself anymore. I was gonna comment. It looks like Sir Equinox was mentioning the Lair of the White Worm, but I'm not sure. I'm going to go ahead and assume that this chat is still going on even without Melissa's presence. Yeah, the Lair of the White Worm is fascinating. I think that's probably my second favorite Stoker novel for sure. Again, he really bites into some uncanny material, that some old legends that are very old that we've never heard since, before or since in sort of popular fiction. And I felt like Ken Russell did a really great job. It's rather cheesy in a lot of ways, but the movie I believe that movie came out in '93, perhaps because of the Stoker or of the Coppola film. That film really kind of touches on some of those same aspects we were just talking about this sort of exploration of Christianity and maybe some inversions of that, and sort of exploring all of that through some of these older legends. I mean, it's a very old Welsh legend, this idea of these sort of worm-like creatures that or who knows what they're up to. In Southern Ireland, I was in an area where I was told some tales of supposedly these giant white worms that had lived in the area, and how they had attacked a very pious man who lived there, and how there were these great epic battles that went on, that he was trying to drive these worms back so that they would stay away from the other people of Ireland. And that fascinated me because of the Lair of the White Worm. It really reminded me how much lore Stoker knew in his own lifetime that he delved into, and how amazing that, you know, even still today, we really don't have a lot of an exploration of some of that stuff he was tapping into. Um, Okay, so yeah, it looks like Melissa's saying I can say goodbye and exit if I want. I just wanted to real quick. I'll go ahead and just hit this last comment here about Matthew's asking about the Antichrist. What about Dracula 2000? The portrayal of Dracula as Judas. Again, I think that's it was an interesting concept, and it's one of those times where they're trying to do something new and invigorating with the character, which I'm all for, you know, as long as it's not being presented as an adaptation of the novel. I don't really remember from promotional materials with the Netflix series how much they were trying to portray it as being an adaptation. It was kind of a weird confluence of some really like strategic points from the novel that made it feel like that's where they were going with it, but then they were also doing very drastically different things as well. So I feel like that maybe that's why it's an uncomfortable fit between the two. But something like Dracula 2000, obviously we hear that by title alone, we know it's going to be drastically different from the get-go and more exploring some of those deeper themes in a modern way. So yeah, I think that you know, that was interesting. And then this whole idea here of the shapeshifter, the realm of the shapeshifter being the oldest form of folklore. Yeah, I think I would agree with that. That really does seem to be. I think early people observing the animal kingdom, you know, began to think a lot about, you know, in the same way that we portray a lot of characters in a anthropomorphic way. You know, we it's nothing. All the, you know, so many movies for kids today and just our advertising, everything. You know, we live in a world where we see anthropomorphized animals rendered in every form. And I think it all kind of goes back to that sort of early conception of what it means to live on this earth and with these sort of qualities of the world. Okay, well, I think, all right. Okay, well, I'm so glad to have gotten to talk to you all today. So I'm so glad that people turned out and had such great questions and comments. There may have been a couple of comments here and there that I missed, but it looks like maybe this is going to be archived, and you know, I'd love to come back through later and address anything one-on-one with any of you that I've missed out on. But yeah, it's great to talk to you, Matthew. Great to talk to, you know, all of you in the chat. Anyone whose questions that you know, I did get the chance to cover while we were talking. I really enjoyed this, and thank you all so much. And yeah, all thanks to Melissa for putting this together. What a great great time. So anyway, hopefully she'll do another special like this in the future that I can be involved in some capacity, whatever that is. All right, take care, everyone. Bye-bye. Thank you.